If someone told you today that your home is in a flood zone and your first reaction was, that doesn't make any sense, that reaction is reasonable. Most homes don't look like they're at risk of flooding. You don't see water nearby, you don't see any warning signs, and you've probably never personally experienced flooding where you live. So when flood insurance suddenly becomes part of the conversation, it feels disconnected from reality. This usually comes up at a moment when you're already making big decisions. You're buying a home, you're refinancing, you're reviewing insurance. Everything feels routine, and then you hear the words flood zone or flood insurance required. That moment creates tension because it feels like new information, not because you're opposed to protecting yourself. What's happening in that moment is a mismatch between how flood risk is measured and how people naturally think about risk. We think in terms of what we've seen. Flood maps think in terms of probability over time. Flood zones are not predictions, they're models. They're designed to answer a long term question based on terrain, elevation, rainfall patterns, and drainage systems. Where is water most likely to go if a major event happens? That's very different from asking whether your house has flooded before or whether flooding feels likely this year. You've probably heard the phrase 100-year flood. That phrase alone has caused enormous confusion. It does not mean flooding happens once every 100 years. It means there's roughly a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. 1% doesn't feel urgent in isolation, it sounds small, but when you stretch that risk across decades of ownership, the math changes. A 1% annual risk doesn't stay 1% over time. Over a 30-year mortgage, the cumulative likelihood becomes meaningful. That's why lenders pay attention to flood zones even when nothing looks risky on the surface. Their concern isn't next year, it's what could happen over the next full life of the loan. When you pull up a FEMA flood map, you'll see colored areas and letters. Zone A or AE generally indicates higher risk. Zone X generally indicates lower risk. What's important to understand is that lower risk does not mean no risk. It simply means the probability is lower based on the available data. This is where assumptions quietly creep in. If flood insurance isn't required, it's easy to assume it isn't necessary. But flooding doesn't check your zone letter before it happens. Heavy rainfall, overwhelmed drainage systems, and runoff don't follow clean boundaries on a map. Picture a long, slow storm moving through an area. Not dramatic, no river overflowing, just steady rain over many hours. Streets start to pool, storm drains struggle to keep up, water backs up into garages and finds its way inside. When that damage happens, homeowners insurance doesn't step in because it's classified as flood damage. That's often the moment when people realize flood insurance was never just about rivers or coastlines. It was about water coming from outside the structure and accumulating on the ground before entering the home. Where that water comes from matters far less than how it enters. The solution here isn't panic or worst case thinking, it's understanding your exposure before you're forced to react to it. FEMA flood maps are public. Anyone can check them. You can go to the FEMA Flood Map Service Center, type in your address, and zoom in until you see your property clearly. Once you do that, the map stops feeling abstract and starts to feel specific to you. Sometimes when people check their address, they're convinced the map must be wrong. The house sits higher on the street, the yard slopes away from the foundation. Nothing about it feels risky, and sometimes that instinct is partially correct. Flood maps are broad tools. They're very good at modeling areas, but they're not perfect at evaluating individual structures. They don't automatically know whether your home was built on raised fill, whether drainage has been improved over time, or how your specific lot compares to nearby properties. That's where elevation comes into play. If a home sits above the base flood elevation, it may qualify for a letter of map amendment, often called a LOMA. This is a formal process that uses elevation data to show that the structure itself is at lower risk than the surrounding area. When approved, it can remove a lender's flood insurance requirement for the structure. This is not automatic and it doesn't apply to every property, but it is an option. And simply knowing that option exists changes the conversation from frustration to verification. Instead of assuming you're stuck, you can confirm whether the data truly applies to your home. Even when flood insurance is required, understanding how coverage works matters. Flood insurance does not function the same way homeowners insurance does. Certain areas of homes are treated differently. Basements, lower levels, and ground level spaces have specific limitations. Some finishes are covered differently than people expect. Certain contents may have restrictions, and mechanical systems are treated differently than living space. None of this is hidden, but it's rarely explained unless you slow down and look at it intentionally. That understanding allows you to plan smarter. It affects what you store at ground level, it affects how you think about renovations, it affects how you manage risk inside the home, not just whether you have a policy. Another assumption that causes confusion is the idea that flood risk only matters near the coast. Statistically, inland flooding accounts for a significant portion of flood losses nationwide. Heavy rainfall doesn't need an ocean to cause damage. It just needs time, volume, and gravity. In drier climates, this can feel counterintuitive. When the ground doesn't absorb water easily, rainfall moves quickly. Washes, channels, and low points fill fast. Flooding in these areas often looks different than people expect, but the damage is no less real. One of the most helpful things you can do is look at a FEMA flood map alongside an aerial image of your neighborhood. Patterns start to emerge. You see slopes, you see low points, you see how water would naturally move if drainage systems were overwhelmed. That context explains why two houses on the same street can be classified differently. A few feet of elevation can meaningfully change the risk profile. Once you see that visually, the map stops feeling arbitrary. Flood zones also influence resale, whether people like it or not. Buyers today are informed. They look things up, they ask questions, and what creates friction in transactions isn't flood risk itself, it's late discovery. When flood exposure is known and explained early, transactions tend to move much more smoothly. Flood insurance pricing has evolved as well. Newer rating methods look at individual characteristics, not just broad zones. Elevation, distance to water, and construction details all matter. Two homes in the same zone can have very different premiums. All of this points back to one core idea. Flood insurance decisions are really risk management decisions. They're not about fear, they're about deciding ahead of time how much uncertainty you're willing to carry and how much you'd rather transfer. If this feels like a lot, that's normal. Flood risk involves low probability, high impact events over long time horizons. Humans are not wired to intuitively assess that kind of risk. That's why models and maps exist to help us make decisions with information instead of instinct alone. The goal here isn't fear, it's certainty. Flood insurance isn't about assuming disaster, it's about removing unknowns. Whether you decide to buy coverage, verify elevation, or simply understand your zone better, the win is clarity. So here's what I'd encourage you to do today. Take a few minutes and check your address on a FEMA flood map. See your zone, then ask yourself a better question than, do I need flood insurance? Ask, if this unlikely but expensive event happened, would I be okay with the outcome? If this explanation helped you understand flood zones and FEMA maps more clearly, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. I make these videos to explain insurance concepts in plain English the same way I'd explain them to someone I care about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.